Family vanished from church picnic in 1994. 30 years later, a wall in the sanctuary was breathing. The brick wall was breathing. Rosa Martinez had been cleaning churches for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like this. The ancient wall behind the altar of Harmony Baptist Church seemed to expand and contract with a rhythm all its own, as if the century-old bricks were lungs drawing air from somewhere deep within the earth. It was 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, and the golden sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast dancing shadows across what should have been a perfectly ordinary wall. Before we dive into this mystery that will unravel 30 years of secrets, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Rosa set down her cleaning supplies and approached the wall cautiously. The sound was almost imperceptible, a soft whooshing like wind through a tunnel. She pressed her weathered palm against the cold bricks and felt it, a gentle pulsing, warm air pushing through hairline cracks in the mortar. Her heart began to race as she realized this wasn't her imagination. The morning had started like any other in Cedar Falls, Virginia. This sleepy town of 3,200 residents was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where the biggest excitement usually came from high school football games and the annual church picnic. Rosa had arrived at Harmony Baptist at dawn, keys jingling in the crisp morning air, ready for another routine day of dusting pews and polishing brass. But there was nothing routine about what she discovered next. As Rosa ran her fingers along the wall's surface, searching for the source of the mysterious airflow, her thumb caught on something metallic wedged between two bricks. She worked it loose carefully, her breath catching when she saw what it was. A delicate pearl bracelet, its clasp broken, as if it had been torn away in haste. The pearls were yellowed with age, but Rosa recognized them immediately. She had seen this bracelet before, 30 years ago, adorning the wrist of Margaret Henderson during Sunday services. Margaret, who had vanished along with her entire family during the church picnic of 1994. Margaret, whose disappearance had haunted this community for 3 decades. The bracelet trembled in Rosa's palm as the implications crashed over her. If Margaret's jewelry was here, wedged behind the altar wall, what did that mean? And why was this wall breathing like something alive? Rosa's mind raced back to that terrible summer day in 1994 when the Henderson family, James the church treasurer, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, had simply vanished without a trace. One moment, they were laughing at the dessert table. The next, they were gone, leaving behind only Margaret's cherry pie cooling on the windowsill and a community forever changed by their absence. But what if they hadn't gone far at all? What if the answer to Cedar Falls's greatest mystery had been breathing quietly behind the altar this entire time, waiting for someone to listen? As Rosa clutched the pearl bracelet, she couldn't have known that her discovery would unleash secrets powerful enough to tear apart everything this close-knit community believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the thin line between disappearance and transformation. Rosa Martinez's hands were still shaking when she called Dr. Samuel Wright at 7:15 that morning. Dr. Wright had been Cedar Falls' unofficial historian for over 2 decades, a man whose passion for the town's past ran as deep as the roots of the ancient oak trees lining Main Street. His grandfather had helped build Harmony Baptist Church brick by brick in 1889, and Samuel knew every story, every secret that these walls had witnessed. But when Rosa's trembling voice described the breathing wall and Margaret Henderson's pearl bracelet, even he fell silent. "Don't touch anything else," Dr. Wright said, his usually calm voice tight with urgency. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." The drive to the church felt like the longest 10 minutes of Samuel's life. As he navigated the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, memories of the Henderson family flooded back with painful clarity. He had been 35 in 1994, a young father himself, and the family's disappearance had shaken him to his core. James Henderson had been more than just the church treasurer. He had been Samuel's friend, a man who shared his love for local history and often helped research the town's archives. Samuel still remembered the last conversation he'd had with James, just 2 days before the family vanished. James had seemed troubled, mentioning irregularities in some old church documents, but he had been vague about the details. Samuel had assumed it was just typical church politics, the kind of minor disputes that plagued every congregation. How wrong he had been! When Samuel arrived at the church, he found Rosa sitting in the front pew, the pearl bracelet cradled in her palms like a wounded bird. The morning light streaming through the windows had shifted, casting long shadows that seemed to point directly at the mysterious wall behind the altar. "Show me," Samuel said simply. Rosa led him to the wall, and Samuel immediately heard what she had discovered: the soft, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the church's foundation. He pressed his ear against the cold bricks, and his blood ran cold. This wasn't just air movement. It was systematic, purposeful, as if something or someone was drawing breath on the other side. "My God," he whispered, running his weathered hands across the wall's surface. "This wall, it's been altered." Samuel's trained eye caught what Rosa had missed. The mortar between certain bricks was newer, a slightly different color that would be invisible to most people, but stood out like a beacon to someone who had studied historical architecture for decades. Someone had sealed a passage here, and recently enough that the modern mortar hadn't had time to weather properly. But what chilled Samuel to the bone was the realization that this modification had been done with expert precision. Whoever had sealed this wall knew exactly what they were doing, and they had wanted it to remain hidden. As Samuel examined the wall more closely, Rosa shared her discovery of the broken pearl bracelet. The clasp was damaged in a way that suggested it had been torn away forcefully, as if Margaret had been pulled or had fallen. But the bracelet's position, wedged so carefully between the bricks, seemed almost intentional, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. "Dr. Wright," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if they never left Cedar Falls at all? What if they've been here all along?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and suffocating. Samuel thought about the extensive searches that had covered every inch of the town and surrounding countryside in 1994. But no one had thought to look inside the church itself. As the two stood before the mysterious wall, neither could have anticipated that Margaret Henderson's bracelet was just the first breadcrumb in a trail that would lead them into the darkest corners of their community's soul. The dusty archives of Cedar Falls Historical Society held secrets that hadn't seen daylight in over a century. Dr. Samuel Wright descended into the basement storage room with the determination of a man possessed. If someone had modified the church wall, there had to be evidence. Original blueprints, construction records, something that would explain what lay behind those breathing bricks. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten history filled his nostrils as he pulled string after string of bare light bulbs, illuminating rows of filing cabinets that stretched back into the shadows. Rosa had returned home, but not before promising to keep their discovery secret until they understood what they were dealing with. The weight of Margaret Henderson's pearl bracelet in Samuel's jacket pocket served as a constant reminder that they were no longer dealing with a cold case. They were walking into something that was very much alive. Samuel's fingers moved methodically through files dating back to the 1880s, searching for the original church construction documents. Cedar Falls had been a crucial stop on the Underground Railroad, and many of the town's older buildings contained hidden passages and secret chambers. But Harmony Baptist Church had always been considered a straightforward structure, its construction well documented and unremarkable, or so everyone had believed. When Samuel finally found the original blueprints, dated 1889 and signed by his own great-grandfather, his breath caught in his throat. The plans showed a completely different layout than the church he had known his entire life. Where the current sanctuary ended at the altar wall, The original design extended much further back, revealing a network of underground chambers connected by narrow passageways. The Underground Railroad passages were clearly marked, but there was something else. Rooms labeled simply as storage that were far too large and elaborate for keeping church supplies. Samuel spread the yellowed papers across a dusty table, his hands trembling as he traced the intricate tunnel system with his finger. The passages connected not just to hidden rooms beneath the church, but extended outward like spider webs, reaching toward the old bank building, the town library, and several historic homes throughout Cedar Falls. But what made Samuel's blood run cold was a penciled notation in the margin, written in handwriting he didn't recognize. Sealed 1994, Emergency Protocol. The date sent chills down his spine. 1994, the same year the Henderson family had vanished. As he continued studying the blueprints, Samuel discovered something else that made him question everything he thought he knew about his hometown. The tunnel system included sophisticated ventilation shafts, drainage systems, and what appeared to be electrical conduits, modifications that were far too modern to have been part of the original 1889 construction. Someone had been maintaining and upgrading this underground network for over a century. The implications were staggering. Multiple families, multiple generations of Cedar Falls residents had been keeping this secret for decades. The Henderson family's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was connected to something much larger, something that had been operating beneath their feet for over 100 years. Samuel photographed every page with his phone, his mind racing with questions. Who had access to these plans? Who knew about the underground chambers? And most importantly, was someone still down there, breathing in the darkness beneath Harmony Baptist Church? As he prepared to leave the archives, Samuel noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There, in the corner of the original blueprint, was a co-signature from someone named J. Henderson. Could this Henderson be related to James? Had the family known about the tunnels all along? What if the Hendersons hadn't been victims at all, but guardians of Cedar Falls' most dangerous secret? Elena Vasquez had been the church secretary for 12 years, but she had never noticed the small scratches on James Henderson's old desk until that Wednesday morning. The mahogany desk had sat untouched in the church office since 1994, a silent monument to the man who had vanished without explanation. Previous secretaries had avoided using it out of respect, and Elena had simply worked around it, treating it like a piece of sacred furniture that held too many memories to disturb. But when she accidentally knocked over her coffee cup, sending the dark liquid cascading across the desk's surface, she discovered something that would change everything. As Elena frantically dabbed at the spilled coffee with paper towels, the liquid seeped into what she had assumed was a solid wood grain. But the coffee revealed hairline cracks in the wood, deliberate cuts that formed the outline of a hidden compartment. Her heart racing, Elena pressed along the edges of the pattern, and, with a soft click, a small section of the desktop lifted away like a puzzle piece. Inside the secret compartment lay a single item, a small brass key attached to a safety deposit box tag from First National Bank of Cedar Falls. The tag bore the number 247 and a name that made Elena's hands tremble. Monsieur Henderson, emergency access only. Elena stared at the key, understanding immediately that she was holding something James Henderson had hidden away for a reason. But Margaret's name on the tag suggested this wasn't just James's secret. It was something they had planned together, something important enough to require emergency access. The discovery came at a moment when the church was buzzing with whispered conversations about Rosa's mysterious activities around the altar wall. Elena had noticed Rosa spending extra time in the sanctuary, sometimes arriving hours before her usual schedule and staying long after evening services ended. The other staff members had begun to talk, wondering if Rosa was having some kind of spiritual crisis, or if there was something wrong with the building itself. But Elena suspected there was more to Rosa's behavior than anyone realized. She had worked in churches long enough to recognize the signs when someone had stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to find. The way Rosa's eyes darted nervously around the sanctuary, the way she seemed to be listening for sounds that no one else could hear, these were the actions of someone carrying a dangerous secret. Now, holding James Henderson's hidden key, Elena understood that she might be the only person who could help Rosa uncover the truth. First National Bank was just 3 blocks away, and Elena knew the manager, Robert Chen, from their shared service on the church's finance committee. If she could convince him to let her access Margaret Henderson's safety deposit box, she might finally understand what had driven the Henderson family to disappear. The walk to the bank felt like a journey through a minefield. Every step brought Elena closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but the Henderson case had always been different. It was the one mystery that the community had agreed, without ever speaking about it directly, to leave alone. But some secrets refused to stay buried, and Elena could feel the weight of 30 years pressing down on her shoulders as she pushed open the heavy glass doors of First National Bank. The key in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg, a small piece of metal that might unlock not just a safety deposit box, but the entire truth about what had happened to Cedar Falls's most beloved family. Robert Chen listened to Elena's explanation with growing concern, his usually friendly demeanor becoming more serious as she described finding the key in James Henderson's desk. When she showed him the tag with Margaret's name, his face went pale. "Elena," he said quietly, glancing around the bank to make sure no one was listening. "That box has been paid for anonymously every year since 1994. Someone has been keeping it active, but no one has ever accessed it." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Someone in Cedar Falls had been maintaining Margaret Henderson's safety deposit box for 30 years, ensuring it remained accessible while never actually opening it. Someone who knew the family's secret and was waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to reveal what lay inside. As Robert led Elena toward the vault, neither of them could have imagined that the contents of Box 247 would prove that the Henderson family's disappearance was just the beginning of a story that was still being written. The safety deposit box held treasures that defied explanation, and a truth more dangerous than Elena Vasquez could have imagined. Box 247 wasn't large, but its contents spoke of careful planning and desperate circumstances. As Robert Chen stepped back to give Elena privacy, she carefully removed each item with trembling hands. First came a stack of financial documents, bank statements, wire transfer records, and accounting ledgers that showed thousands of dollars moving through accounts she didn't recognize. The transactions dated back to 1993 and continued right up until the week the Henderson family disappeared. But it was the photographs that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Black and white images of people she recognized, church members, town council officials, local business owners, meeting in locations she didn't know. The photos were taken from a distance, as if James or Margaret had been conducting surveillance, documenting secret gatherings that were never meant to be witnessed. At the bottom of the box, sealed in a plastic bag, lay a letter addressed to whoever finds this first, in Margaret Henderson's careful handwriting. Elena's hands shook as she opened the envelope, but her excitement quickly turned to frustration. The letter was written entirely in code, a complex series of numbers, symbols, and abbreviated words that meant nothing to her untrained eye. However, clipped to the coded letter was a small note in plain English that made Elena's heart race. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to us. The code key is hidden where we first kissed. Samuel Wright will understand. Trust no one in authority until you know the truth about the Watchers. The children must be protected at all costs. M.H." Elena read the note 3 times, her mind spinning with implications. Margaret had known something was going to happen to her family. She had prepared for their disappearance, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs for someone brave enough to follow. But the reference to the Watchers sent chills down Elena's spine. Who were they watching? And why did Margaret feel the children needed protection? The mention of Samuel Wright confirmed what Elena had begun to suspect. Dr. Wright knew more about the Henderson case than he had ever revealed publicly. If Margaret trusted him with the location of the code key, then Samuel had been part of their inner circle, perhaps even helping them document whatever conspiracy they had uncovered. Elena photographed every document with her phone, her hands shaking so badly that several images came out blurred. She made sure to capture the coded letter from multiple angles, knowing that breaking the code would be crucial to understanding what the Hendersons had discovered. The financial records showed a pattern of money laundering that implicated some of Cedar Falls's most respected citizens, but without the decoded letter, she couldn't understand the full scope of what James and Margaret had uncovered. As Elena prepared to leave the bank, Robert Chen approached her with an expression of deep concern. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has anyone else been asking about the Henderson accounts recently?" The question caught Elena off guard. "What do you mean?" "2 weeks ago, someone called asking about dormant accounts from the 1990s. They didn't mention the Hendersons specifically, but they knew details about the account structures that only someone with inside knowledge would know. I thought it was strange at the time, but now—" Robert's voice trailed off as he glanced nervously around the bank. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Someone else was investigating the Henderson case. Someone with enough knowledge to ask the right questions. But were they friend or foe? Were they trying to help uncover the truth? Or were they working to keep the secrets buried? As Elena left the bank with Margaret Henderson's coded letter burning like evidence in her purse, she realized that she was no longer just uncovering a 30-year-old mystery. She was walking into an active conspiracy that involved people who were still alive, still watching, and still willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. The question that haunted her as she walked back toward the church was simple but terrifying. If the Hendersons had been silenced for what they knew, what would happen to anyone else who tried to decode their final message? But Elena had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The coded letter held the key to everything, and she was determined to find Samuel Wright and unlock the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching her enter and leave the bank. Someone who now knew that Margaret Henderson's secrets were no longer safely buried in Box 247. Rosa Martinez found the white lilies at 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, their petals still damp with dew, and their stems cut with surgical precision. The flowers lay in a small alcove within the hidden passage behind the breathing wall, arranged with the same care someone might use to decorate a grave. Rosa had been exploring the narrow opening she'd discovered after carefully removing several loose bricks, armed with nothing but a flashlight and her growing determination to understand what lay behind the mysterious wall. The passage was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber that took her breath away. The underground room was roughly the size of a church classroom, with stone walls that showed clear signs of recent maintenance. Modern LED lighting strips had been installed along the ceiling, connected to electrical cables that snaked through carefully drilled holes in the ancient stonework. Someone had been down here recently, very recently, and they had been living here in comfort. But it was the shrine that stopped Rosa in her tracks. Against the far wall, someone had created a memorial to the Henderson family. 5 photographs hung in simple frames. James with his warm smile, Margaret with her gentle eyes, and their 3 children frozen in time at the ages they had been when they disappeared. Below the photographs, fresh white lilies filled crystal vases, their sweet fragrance filling the underground chamber with the scent of life in a place that should have been filled only with death and decay. Rosa approached the shrine with reverent steps, her flashlight beam dancing across details that made her heart race. The photographs weren't the standard family portraits that had appeared in newspapers after the disappearance. These were candid shots, intimate moments captured by someone who knew the family well. Margaret laughing at a kitchen table, James reading to his youngest daughter. The children playing in a yard Rosa didn't recognize. But what truly terrified Rosa was the realization that the flowers couldn't have been there for more than a day or two. White lilies didn't last long once cut, and these were perfect, their petals unblemished, and their stems strong. Someone had been in this chamber within the last 48 hours. Someone who cared enough about the Henderson family to maintain this underground memorial for 30 years. As Rosa continued exploring the chamber, she discovered evidence of regular habitation. A small area had been set up as a living space, complete with a cot, a battery-powered radio, and shelves lined with canned goods and water bottles. Books were stacked neatly on a makeshift table. Some were novels, but others were technical manuals about electrical systems, water filtration, and underground construction. Someone wasn't just visiting this space. They were living here, at least part of the time. The discovery that shook Rosa to her core came when she found a jacket hanging on a peg near the living area. It was a woman's cardigan, navy blue with pearl buttons, and it looked exactly like something Margaret Henderson would have worn. The fabric was old but well-maintained, as if someone had been caring for it with the devotion usually reserved for religious relics. Rosa carefully examined the cardigan and found a small embroidered monogram on the inner collar. M.H. Margaret Henderson. But the cardigan showed no signs of being underground for 30 years. The fabric was clean, the buttons were polished, and there was even a faint scent of lavender, as if it had been recently washed and stored with sachets. The implications crashed over Rosa like a wave. Either someone had been preserving Margaret Henderson's clothing with obsessive care for 3 decades, or Margaret Henderson herself had been wearing this cardigan recently. The thought seemed impossible, but Rosa could no longer dismiss any possibility, no matter how incredible it might seem. As she prepared to leave the chamber, Rosa noticed something else that made her blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dusty stone floor, leading from the living area to the shrine and back again. The prints were made by women's shoes, approximately size 7, and they were recent enough that Rosa could make out the tread pattern clearly. But what really terrified Rosa was the realization that the footprints led not just around the chamber, but toward a second passage that she hadn't noticed before, a narrow tunnel that disappeared into the darkness beyond her flashlight's reach. Someone had been in this chamber recently, and they had gone deeper into the underground network, deeper into secrets that Rosa was only beginning to understand. As Rosa carefully made her way back through the breathing wall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. She had found evidence that someone connected to the Henderson family was still alive, still active, and still maintaining this underground shrine after 30 years. But the question that haunted her as she emerged into the sanctuary was simple and terrifying. If Margaret Henderson was still alive, why had she remained hidden for so long? And what was she hiding from that was dangerous enough to require 30 years of secrecy? The fresh lilies had revealed more than just someone's devotion. They had revealed that the Henderson family's story was far from over. Dorothy Mills had been keeping secrets for 30 years, but the weight of them was finally becoming too much to bear. At 78 years old, Dorothy was one of the few remaining church members who had been present the day the Henderson family disappeared. She had been Margaret's closest friend, the one person Margaret had trusted with her fears in those final terrifying weeks before the family vanished. Now, as whispers about strange activities around the church began to circulate through Cedar Falls, Dorothy knew the time had come to break her silence. The decision wasn't easy. Dorothy had made a promise to Margaret Henderson in the summer of 1994, a promise sealed with tears and desperation in the back pew of Harmony Baptist Church. "If something happens to us," Margaret had whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched Dorothy's arm, "you have to promise me you won't tell anyone about the Watchers. Not until it's safe. Not until you're sure the children are protected." Dorothy had kept that promise for 3 decades, watching as search parties scoured the countryside, as FBI agents questioned every resident of Cedar Falls, as the community slowly learned to live with the mystery of the Henderson family's disappearance. She had bitten her tongue through countless conversations about what might have happened, forcing herself to nod along with theories about family troubles or financial problems, knowing all the while that the truth was far more sinister. The Watchers weren't a figment of Margaret's imagination. They were real, and they were dangerous. Dorothy had seen them herself in those final weeks. Shadows that seemed to follow Margaret wherever she went. Cars that appeared in the church parking lot during services, occupied by people who never came inside. Phone calls at odd hours that ended in silence when Margaret answered. Most disturbing of all, evidence that someone had been inside the Henderson home when the family wasn't there. Small things moved, papers shuffled, a sense that their private space had been violated. Margaret had confided to Dorothy that James had stumbled upon something while auditing the church's financial records, something that connected several prominent Cedar Falls families to activities that went far beyond simple embezzlement. The missing church funds weren't being stolen, they were being used to support a network of families throughout the community, families who needed help with medical bills, home repairs, and other expenses that threatened their financial stability. But the help came with strings attached. The families who received assistance were expected to provide services in return, information about their neighbors, reports on unusual activities, and, most importantly, silence about the source of their aid. What had started as a charitable organization had evolved into something much more controlling, a web of obligation and surveillance that extended throughout Cedar Falls. James and Margaret had been documenting this network for months, taking photographs of secret meetings and tracing financial connections between seemingly unrelated businesses and organizations. They had discovered that the Watchers weren't just observing the Henderson family, they were monitoring anyone who showed signs of asking too many questions about how their quiet town really operated. Dorothy's breaking point came when she realized that Rosa Martinez was in danger. The maintenance workers' sudden interest in the church's structural details hadn't gone unnoticed by the Watchers, and Dorothy had begun to see the same signs that had preceded the Henderson family's disappearance. Cars in the church parking lot with unfamiliar occupants. Phone calls to the church office that ended when Dorothy answered. Most tellingly, she had noticed people she didn't recognize attending recent Sunday services, sitting in the back pews and leaving before the final hymn. The decision to approach Elena Vasquez wasn't made lightly, but Dorothy had watched the church secretary's growing anxiety over the past week and knew that Elena had discovered something significant. When Dorothy saw Elena returning from the bank with the pale, shaken expression of someone who had seen too much, she knew the time for silence had passed. "Elena," Dorothy said, cornering the younger woman in the church kitchen after Wednesday evening service, "we need to talk about what you found in that safety deposit box. And we need to talk about why Margaret Henderson left you that coded message." Elena's face went white. "How did you—" "Because Margaret told me she was going to leave clues for someone brave enough to follow them," Dorothy interrupted. She knew that someday someone would need to finish what she and James started. "The question is, are you prepared for what that means?" Dorothy led Elena to her small apartment above the church nursery, a space that had served as her home since her husband died 15 years earlier. The apartment was modest, but Dorothy had transformed one wall into something that took Elena's breath away. A detailed map of Cedar Falls with red pins marking locations, photographs connected by colored string, and newspaper clippings dating back to 1994. "This," Dorothy said, gesturing to her makeshift investigation board, "is what Margaret and James were really working on. They weren't just tracking missing church funds. They were mapping a conspiracy that reaches into every major family and business in Cedar Falls." Elena stared at the board, recognizing faces from the photographs she had found in the safety deposit box. But Dorothy's collection was more comprehensive, showing connections and patterns that painted a picture of systematic control over their small town's economy and social structure. The Watchers, Dorothy continued, aren't outsiders. They're our neighbors, our friends, people we've trusted for decades. They've been using charity as a weapon, creating dependencies that keep people silent and compliant. And anyone who threatens to expose them— Dorothy's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. As Elena absorbed the magnitude of what Dorothy was showing her, a chilling realization settled over both women. If the Watchers had been willing to eliminate the Henderson family to protect their secret, what would they do to anyone else who tried to expose the truth? But perhaps more terrifying was the question neither woman dared to voice. If the Henderson family had discovered the Watchers' secret in 1994, and if someone was still maintaining Margaret's shrine in the underground chamber, did that mean the family's story had a very different ending than anyone had imagined? Professor Maria Santos had seen many geological surveys in her 20-year career, but the ground-penetrating radar readings from beneath Harmony Baptist Church defied every natural explanation she could imagine. Elena had contacted Maria through Dr. Wright, knowing that they needed scientific proof of what they suspected lay beneath Cedar Falls before they could safely expose the truth about the Watchers. Maria's expertise in underground geology made her the perfect person to map the tunnel system without alerting anyone to their investigation. What she discovered beneath the church grounds changed everything they thought they knew about their small town. "This is impossible," Maria whispered as she studied the radar readings on her laptop screen. The underground network wasn't just extensive, it was sophisticated beyond anything that should have existed in a town like Cedar Falls. The tunnels formed a complex web, stretching beneath the entire downtown area, connecting the church to the old bank building, the town library, the courthouse, and at least 12 private residences. But what made Maria's hands tremble as she traced the digital map was the evidence of recent construction and maintenance. The radar showed modern materials, steel reinforcements, updated electrical conduits, and what appeared to be a comprehensive ventilation system. Someone had been expanding and improving this underground network for decades, turning what might have started as simple underground railroad passages into something that resembled a secret city beneath Cedar Falls. Dr. Wright, Elena, and Dorothy gathered around Maria's laptop in the church basement, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the radar imagery. The scope of what they were seeing rendered them speechless. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a fully functional parallel infrastructure that could support dozens of people indefinitely. "Look at this," Maria said, pointing to a section of the map near the town center. "These chambers are large enough to serve as meeting rooms, and this area here shows signs of regular human activity. The ground temperature variations suggest that people have been using these spaces recently, maybe even daily." Elena thought about the financial records she had found in Margaret's safety deposit box, and suddenly the pattern became clear. The missing church funds hadn't just been used to control families through charity. They had been financing the maintenance and expansion of this underground network. For over a century, someone had been building a hidden Cedar Falls beneath the one that everyone could see. Dr. Wright studied the tunnel entrances marked on Maria's map and felt his blood run cold. Several of the access points were located in buildings owned by families he had known his entire life. People who served on the town council, who ran local businesses, who had been pillars of the community for generations. The Watchers weren't just a small conspiracy. They were the community, or at least the part of it that really mattered. "There's something else," Maria said, highlighting a section of the map that showed unusual activity near the church. "The radar is picking up movement patterns that suggest someone is living down there, probably in the area Rosa discovered. But the readings also show recent excavation work, as if they've been expanding or modifying the space even more recently." Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what this meant. Whoever was maintaining Margaret's shrine wasn't just visiting occasionally. They were actively working to expand the underground network, preparing for something that required more space, more resources, more secrecy. We need to understand what we're really dealing with before we go any further, Dr. Wright said, his voice heavy with concern. If this network has been operating for over a century, then we're not just uncovering a conspiracy. We're threatening an institution that has shaped this town for generations. Maria's geological training kicked in as she studied the tunnel system more closely. The engineering required for this level of construction would have required significant expertise and resources. This isn't something a small group could have accomplished in secret. We're talking about a multi-generational project that would have involved architects, engineers, electricians, and construction workers, all of whom would have had to keep the secret. The implications were staggering. The underground network represented more than just hidden passages. It was evidence of a parallel society that had been operating beneath Cedar Falls for over 100 years. The Watchers weren't just monitoring the town, they were running it from below, using the tunnel system to move freely, to meet in secret, and to control the community above without ever being seen. Elena thought about the photographs she had found in Margaret's safety deposit box, images of secret meetings between respected community members. Now she understood where those meetings had been taking place, in underground chambers that existed in a world completely separate from the Cedar Falls that ordinary residents knew. But as the group studied Maria's findings, a disturbing question emerged. If this underground network had been operating successfully for over a century, why had the Henderson family posed such a threat that they had to be eliminated? What had James and Margaret discovered that was dangerous enough to disrupt a system that had remained hidden for generations? The answer came to Dorothy like a lightning bolt. They weren't just documenting the financial conspiracy, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were mapping the tunnels themselves. Margaret told me that James had been exploring the church basement and had found inconsistencies in the building's layout. They were going to expose not just the Watchers, but the entire underground infrastructure. Maria's radar readings had revealed more than just tunnels. They had revealed that Cedar Falls itself was built on a foundation of secrets that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. And somewhere in that underground maze, someone was still working, still planning, still maintaining the hidden world that kept the Watchers in power. The question that haunted all of them as they stared at the digital map was simple, but terrifying. If they had stumbled upon a secret that had been successfully hidden for over a century, how long would it be before the Watchers decided that they too had become too dangerous to live? But there was no turning back now. The underground network had been revealed, and with it, the true scope of what they were fighting against. The breathing wall had been just the beginning. The real mystery lay in the dark tunnels beneath their feet, where secrets lived and breathed in the shadows. Rosa Martinez found the first note slipped under her apartment door on a Friday morning, and the handwriting made her heart stop beating. The message was written on cream-colored paper in the same elegant script that Rosa had seen in Margaret Henderson's diary entries from the church archives. But that was impossible. Margaret Henderson had been gone for 30 years, and the ink on this note was fresh, the paper crisp and new. Rosa's hands trembled as she read the cryptic message. The truth beneath our feet grows stronger with each passing day. The Watchers believe they control the darkness, but they are wrong. Meet me where the lilies bloom eternal. A friend who remembers. Rosa sank into her kitchen chair, staring at the note until the words seemed to blur together. She had been receiving anonymous messages for 3 days now, each one more specific and more impossible than the last. The second note had contained detailed instructions about which bricks to remove from the breathing wall to access the hidden chamber safely. The third had warned her about specific people to avoid, names that included some of Cedar Falls's most respected citizens, people Rosa had trusted her entire life. But this fourth note was different. It wasn't just offering guidance or warnings, it was requesting a meeting, and the reference to where the lilies bloom eternal could only mean one place: the underground shrine where Rosa had discovered the fresh white lilies just days earlier. Rosa thought about the handwriting analysis she had seen in detective shows and crime documentaries. If these notes really were written by Margaret Henderson, then the woman who had disappeared 30 years ago was not only alive, but actively reaching out, guiding Rosa through the dangerous process of uncovering the truth about Cedar Falls. But the alternative explanation was even more unsettling. Someone else had been studying Margaret's handwriting for 3 decades, perfecting an imitation so complete that it could fool anyone who had known her. The decision to meet this mysterious correspondent wasn't made lightly. Rosa had worked in enough churches to recognize the signs of spiritual testing, but this felt different, more dangerous, and more necessary than any challenge she had faced before. The underground chamber had become a second home to her over the past week, a place where she could think clearly away from the watching eyes that seemed to follow her everywhere in the town above. As Rosa prepared for the midnight meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking toward a moment that would change everything. The notes had been leading her somewhere specific, preparing her for a revelation that would either answer all her questions or put her in danger beyond anything she could imagine. The journey through the breathing wall had become routine, but tonight it felt different. The underground chamber seemed to pulse with anticipation, and the fresh lilies at the shrine glowed almost luminously in the beam of Rosa's flashlight. She had arrived early, hoping to observe whoever had been leaving the notes before revealing herself, but the chamber appeared empty. Then she heard it, a soft humming coming from the deeper tunnel that led further into the underground network. The melody was familiar, a hymn that Rosa recognized from Sunday services, but the voice singing it was aged and weathered in a way that spoke of decades of sorrow and isolation. Rosa followed the sound deeper into the tunnel system than she had ever ventured before, her flashlight beam revealing walls that showed increasing evidence of recent habitation. Electric cables ran along the ceiling, providing soft LED lighting that made her flashlight unnecessary. The air was warmer here, circulated by ventilation systems that kept the underground spaces surprisingly comfortable. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber that took Rosa's breath away. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a home. Comfortable furniture, shelves lined with books, a small kitchen area with modern appliances connected to hidden electrical and water lines. But what stopped Rosa in her tracks was the woman sitting in a rocking chair near a small electric heater, her silver hair neatly braided, and her face lined with 30 years of careful living in the shadows. Margaret Henderson looked up from the book she was reading and smiled at Rosa with the same gentle expression that had graced the photographs in the underground shrine. "Hello, Rosa," she said, her voice carrying the soft Virginia accent that longtime residents still remembered. "Thank you for coming. I've been watching your progress, and I think it's time we talked." Rosa felt her legs give out, and she sank into a nearby chair, staring at the woman who was supposed to be dead, or missing, or anything except sitting peacefully in an underground living room beneath Cedar Falls. Margaret looked older, certainly, but healthy and alert, as if the past 30 years had been spent in comfortable retirement rather than mysterious disappearance. "You're alive!" Rosa whispered, the words seeming inadequate for the magnitude of what she was witnessing. "Yes," Margaret replied simply. "We all are. James is sleeping. He doesn't handle late nights as well as he used to. The children are grown now, of course, with families of their own. They visit when they can, when it's safe." Margaret's expression grew sad as she continued. "We never wanted to disappear, Rosa. We were forced underground to protect not just ourselves, but everyone who was depending on us to keep the truth hidden." As Rosa listened to Margaret's explanation, she began to understand that the Henderson family's disappearance hadn't been an escape or an elimination. It had been a strategic retreat into a world that already existed, a world where they could continue their work of protecting Cedar Falls from the Watchers without putting innocent people in danger. But the question that burned in Rosa's mind was simple and terrifying. If the Henderson family had been living underground for 30 years, what were they hiding from that was powerful enough to keep them in the shadows for 3 decades? Margaret seemed to read Rosa's thoughts. "The Watchers aren't just monitoring Cedar Falls," she said quietly. "They're preparing it for something much larger, something that will change not just our little town, but the entire region. And we're the only ones who know how to stop them." Margaret Henderson's revelation about the Watchers' true purpose sent chills through Rosa's entire body. But it was the mention of the Blue Ridge Mountains that made everything click into place. "The cabin!" Rosa whispered, remembering Dr. Wright's research about the mysterious property purchased just after the Henderson family's disappearance. "You've been using the cabin in the mountains?" Margaret nodded gravely. "The cabin is just one piece of a much larger network. The Watchers have been establishing control points throughout Virginia and the surrounding states for over 50 years. Cedar Falls isn't just their test site. It's their headquarters for an operation that extends far beyond what any of us initially understood." As Margaret spoke, she led Rosa to a wall covered with maps, photographs, and documents that revealed the true scope of what the Henderson family had been investigating. The materials showed a conspiracy that stretched across multiple states, connecting small towns throughout the Appalachian region in a web of financial control and social manipulation that made Cedar Falls look like just one small piece of a massive puzzle. "The charity network isn't unique to our town," Margaret explained, pointing to red pins scattered across the map. "They've been implementing the same system in dozens of communities, creating dependencies through financial assistance, then using those dependencies to control local politics, business decisions, and social structures. But Cedar Falls is special because it's where they've been perfecting the underground infrastructure that allows them to operate completely, hidden from federal oversight." Rosa stared at the evidence spread before her, understanding for the first time why the Henderson family had felt they had no choice but to disappear. They hadn't just uncovered a local conspiracy. They had discovered a regional organization with the resources and patience to transform entire communities over the course of generations. Margaret pulled out a thick folder filled with documents that made Rosa's hands shake. Financial records showing millions of dollars moving between accounts in different states. Architectural plans for underground networks in towns Rosa had never heard of. Most disturbing of all, government documents that suggested the Watchers had infiltrated state and federal agencies, creating a protection network that reached far beyond the borders of Virginia. "James and I spent 2 years documenting all of this before we realized we were in immediate danger," Margaret continued. "The Watchers had become aware of our investigation, and they made it clear that our choices were simple: disappear voluntarily or be disappeared permanently. We chose to vanish on our own terms, using the underground network they had created to hide from them while continuing our work." Rosa thought about the fresh flowers in the shrine, the well-maintained living spaces, the sophisticated electrical and ventilation systems. "You've been sabotaging them from the inside," she realized, "using their own infrastructure against them." Margaret smiled grimly. "For 30 years, we've been documenting their expansion, intercepting their communications, and slowly undermining their operations. We've prevented them from implementing their control systems in at least a dozen other communities, and we've been gathering evidence that will eventually allow law enforcement to shut down the entire network." But as Margaret spoke, Rosa detected something in her voice that suggested the situation had recently become more urgent. "What's changed?" Rosa asked. "Why are you revealing yourselves now?" Margaret's expression grew dark. "Because they're accelerating their timeline. Something has made them impatient, and they're preparing to implement the final phase of their plan within the next few months. If we don't stop them soon, the window of opportunity will close forever." Margaret led Rosa to a computer setup that would have impressed any technology expert. Multiple monitors displayed real-time information about financial transactions, communication intercepts, and surveillance footage from cameras the Henderson family had secretly installed throughout the underground network. The sophistication of their operation was breathtaking. They had created their own intelligence agency operating entirely in the shadows beneath Cedar Falls. The Watchers are planning something they call Integration Day, Margaret explained, pulling up files that made Rosa's blood run cold. It's a coordinated effort to simultaneously implement their control systems in 43 communities across 7 states. Once Integration Day happens, they'll have effective control over a population of nearly 2 million people, all of whom will be dependent on the Watchers' charity network for their basic needs. Rosa stared at the documents, understanding that she was looking at plans for what amounted to a bloodless coup that would create a shadow government controlling a significant portion of the American Southeast. The scope of the conspiracy was beyond anything she could have imagined when she first noticed the breathing wall. But there's hope, Margaret continued. We've identified the central command structure, and we know that the entire network depends on the underground infrastructure here in Cedar Falls. If we can expose the truth about what's happening beneath our town, we can bring down the entire operation before Integration Day occurs. As Margaret spoke, Rosa realized that her discovery of the breathing wall hadn't been accidental. It had been orchestrated by the Henderson family as part of a carefully planned revelation designed to bring the truth to light at exactly the right moment. She had been chosen, guided, and prepared for a role in exposing one of the most sophisticated conspiracies in American history. What do you need me to do? Rosa asked, understanding that her life had just taken a turn that would either make her a hero or get her killed. Margaret's smile was both grateful and sad. We need you to help us bring our friends above ground into the light. Dr. Wright, Elena, Dorothy, they've all been moving toward this truth, and it's time to unite everyone who's been working in isolation. Because in 3 weeks, when Integration Day arrives, it will be too late to stop what the Watchers have been building for over half a century. As Rosa absorbed the magnitude of what Margaret was asking, she understood that the breathing wall had led her to something far more important than a 30-year-old mystery. It had led her to the front lines of a battle for the soul of small-town America, and the outcome would determine whether communities like Cedar Falls remained free or became the foundation of something much darker and more controlling than anyone above ground could imagine. The sanctuary of Harmony Baptist Church had never felt more like a battlefield than it did at 11:45 p.m. on that pivotal Saturday night. Rosa stood behind the altar, her heart pounding as she waited for the others to arrive for the meeting that would either save Cedar Falls or destroy everyone who had dared to uncover the truth. Margaret Henderson remained hidden in the underground chamber, monitoring the situation through cameras she had installed throughout the church over the past 30 years. The plan was simple but dangerous. Reveal everything to Dr. Wright, Elena, and Dorothy simultaneously. Then coordinate a strategy to expose the Watchers before Integration Day arrived. Dr. Wright was the first to arrive, his face grave with the weight of secrets he had been carrying for decades. Elena followed close behind, clutching a folder containing printouts of the coded message she and Dorothy had been working to decipher. Dorothy entered last, moving with the careful steps of someone who understood that this meeting would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. "Before we begin," Rosa said, her voice echoing strangely in the empty sanctuary, "I need all of you to understand that what I'm about to show you will change everything you believe about Cedar Falls, about the people you've trusted, and about the danger we're all facing." Rosa led the group to the breathing wall, which seemed to pulse with anticipation in the dim light. With practiced movements, she removed the loose bricks and gestured toward the hidden passage. "The Henderson family didn't disappear 30 years ago," she said simply. "They went underground, and they've been fighting to protect this community ever since." The journey through the passage felt like a descent into another world. Elena clutched Dorothy's arm for support as they squeezed through the narrow opening, while Dr. Wright's archaeological training helped him navigate the ancient stonework with surprising agility. When they emerged into Margaret's underground living space, the sight of the woman they had mourned for 3 decades left all 3 visitors speechless. Margaret Henderson rose from her chair with the grace of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. "Hello, Samuel," she said, embracing her old friend. "Hello, Dorothy. And Elena, thank you for being brave enough to follow the clues I left for you." The reunion was emotional but brief. Margaret quickly guided the group to her command center, where the evidence of the Watchers' conspiracy covered every surface. As she explained the true scope of what they were facing, Dorothy began to understand why Margaret had asked her to keep silent for so long. The charity network was just the beginning, Margaret explained, showing them financial records that revealed the Watchers' true source of funding. They've been receiving money from federal agencies, multinational corporations, and political organizations that see small-town America as the perfect testing ground for social control experiments. Dr. Wright studied architectural plans that showed the underground network extending far beyond what Maria's radar had detected. They're not just controlling Cedar Falls, he realized. They're using our town as a laboratory to perfect techniques they plan to implement nationwide. Elena finally understood why the coded message had been so complex. "You weren't just documenting local corruption," she said to Margaret. "You were recording evidence of something that reaches all the way to Washington, D.C." Margaret nodded grimly. The Watchers have connections in the federal government, in major corporations, and in academic institutions studying social engineering. Cedar Falls is just one of several communities being used to test how effectively they can control population centers through a combination of financial dependency, social pressure, and infrastructure manipulation. But it was Dorothy who asked the question that had been haunting all of them. "If you've been gathering evidence for 30 years, why haven't you exposed them already?" Margaret's expression grew sad. "Because every time we've tried to contact law enforcement or federal agencies, we've discovered that the Watchers have people inside those organizations too. Any evidence we've attempted to submit has been either buried or used to identify and eliminate other people who were asking dangerous questions." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, but so was the reason for Margaret's decision to surface now. "Integration Day isn't just about controlling 43 communities," she explained. "It's about demonstrating to their federal backers that the techniques, perfected in places like Cedar Falls, can be scaled up to control entire regions of the country." Rosa felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders as she realized that their small group represented the only people who both understood the threat and had the means to stop it. "What's our plan?" she asked. Margaret pulled out a detailed map showing the underground network's central control room, located directly beneath the Cedar Falls courthouse. The entire system depends on servers and communication equipment housed in a chamber that the Watchers believe is completely secure. If we can access that room and copy their files, we'll have evidence that even their people in law enforcement won't be able to suppress. Dr. Wright studied the architectural plans with growing concern. "The access point is through the old bank building's basement," he realized. "That means we'll have to go through territory the Watchers control completely." Elena thought about the financial records she had discovered, understanding now that they represented just a tiny fraction of the evidence needed to expose the full conspiracy. "How do we know we can trust anyone once we have the evidence?" she asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Because James has been in contact with a federal task force that operates outside normal channels, investigators who specialize in exposing corruption that reaches into government agencies themselves. They've been waiting for someone with inside access to provide them with the proof they need to move against the Watchers." As the group absorbed the magnitude of their mission, Dorothy asked the question that none of them wanted to face. "What happens to us after we expose them?" People who threaten organizations this powerful don't usually live to see the trials. Margaret's expression grew serious. That's why the underground network exists. If we succeed, some of us may need to disappear just like James and I did 30 years ago. But if we fail, Integration Day will succeed, and everything we've fought to protect will be lost forever. As midnight approached, the group realized that they were no longer just investigating a mystery. They were about to attempt something that would either free their community or destroy everyone who had dared to challenge the Watchers' power. The breathing wall had led them to this moment, and there was no turning back from the battle that would determine Cedar Falls' future. The journey through the Watchers' underground highway began at 2:17 a.m., and with each step deeper into the network, Rosa could feel the weight of a century's worth of secrets pressing down on them from above. Margaret led the group through passages that Rosa had never seen before, tunnels that stretched far beyond the church grounds and into the very heart of Cedar Falls' power structure. The underground pathways were more sophisticated here, with smooth concrete walls, modern lighting systems, and security cameras that Margaret disabled with devices James had built specifically for this mission. "Stay close and stay quiet," Margaret whispered as they moved through corridors that felt more like the basement of a government building than tunnels beneath a small Virginia town. The Watchers have motion sensors throughout this section, but James mapped their blind spots years ago. Dr. Wright marveled at the engineering as they passed through chambers that served various functions: communication centers, meeting rooms, and what appeared to be living quarters for people who preferred to conduct their business entirely underground. The scope of the infrastructure confirmed everything Margaret had told them about the Watchers' resources and long-term planning. Elena clutched the copying devices Margaret had given her, understanding that their success depended on her ability to download files quickly and silently from the central servers. Dorothy, despite her age, moved with surprising agility through the tunnels, driven by 30 years of suppressed anger at the people who had forced her friend into exile. The approach to the courthouse basement required navigating through the old bank building, which had been converted into the Watchers' primary operational center decades earlier. Margaret led them through a service tunnel that emerged behind a false wall in the bank's vault, a location that provided perfect cover for their infiltration. As they moved through the bank's basement, Rosa could see evidence of the Watchers' true activities. Computer servers hummed quietly in climate-controlled rooms. Filing cabinets stretched along walls, containing physical records that probably dated back to the network's founding. Most disturbing of all, monitoring stations displayed real-time surveillance feeds from cameras positioned throughout Cedar Falls, showing that the Watchers had been watching everyone all the time for years. "My God," Dr. Wright whispered as he studied the surveillance setup. "They've been recording everything, every conversation, every meeting, every private moment in this town." Margaret nodded grimly. "The surveillance network extends to 42 other communities. They've been building detailed psychological profiles of entire populations, identifying people who might pose threats and neutralizing them before they become dangerous." The final approach to the central server room required the most dangerous part of their mission. Margaret had to disable multiple security systems while the others waited in a maintenance tunnel, knowing that any mistake would alert the Watchers to their presence and probably result in their immediate capture or worse. When Margaret finally signaled that it was safe to proceed, the group entered a chamber that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Banks of servers lined the walls, their LED indicators blinking like electronic constellations. Multiple workstations displayed data feeds that showed financial transactions, communication intercepts, and status reports from Watchers stationed throughout the southeastern United States. "This is it," Margaret said, pointing Elena toward the central terminal. "Everything they've built, everything they're planning, it's all stored in these systems. Download everything you can, but work quickly. We have maybe 10 minutes before their security protocols detect our presence." As Elena worked feverishly to copy the Watchers' files, the others explored the chamber and discovered evidence that made their blood run cold. Integration Day wasn't just about implementing control systems in 43 communities. It was the beginning of a plan to expand the Watchers' influence to every small town in America over the next decade. Dorothy found files that showed how the Watchers had been identifying and eliminating potential threats for years. The Henderson family hadn't been their first targets, and they wouldn't be the last if Integration Day succeeded. Rosa discovered communications between the Watchers and federal agencies that suggested the government itself was interested in scaling up the Cedar Falls experiment. As a tool for managing domestic dissent, Dr. Wright's archaeological training helped him understand the historical significance of what they were seeing. This isn't just contemporary conspiracy, he realized. They've been building this network since the end of World War II, using techniques developed by intelligence agencies and adapting them for domestic population control. But it was Margaret who made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a secured section of the servers, she found evidence that the Watchers had been planning to eliminate their entire group within days. The organization had identified all of them as threats and had already begun implementing protocols to ensure their silence. "We need to leave now," Margaret said urgently, as alarm indicators began flashing on several monitoring stations. "They know we're here." Elena's hands flew over the keyboard as she finished copying the last critical files. "Got it," she said, disconnecting her devices just as the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnels behind them. The escape through the underground network became a desperate race against time as the Watchers mobilized to intercept them. Margaret led them through passages she had memorized over 30 years of careful exploration, but Rosa could hear their pursuers getting closer with each turn. "There," Margaret said, pointing toward a tunnel that led back toward the church. "James is waiting with transportation that will get us to the federal task force." As they emerged from the underground network into the basement of Harmony Baptist Church, Rosa realized that they had done more than gather evidence. They had declared war on an organization that had controlled their community for generations. The breathing wall had led them to this moment, and now everything depended on whether the truth they had uncovered would be powerful enough to bring down the Watchers before Integration Day arrived. But behind them, in the tunnels they had just escaped, Rosa could hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer. The Watchers knew who they were, where they lived, and how dangerous they had become. The real battle for Cedar Falls was just beginning, and the outcome would determine whether small-town America remained free or became the foundation of something much darker than anyone above ground could imagine. The evidence was secure, but the people who had gathered it were now marked for elimination by the most sophisticated conspiracy in American history. James Henderson hadn't seen sunlight in 30 years. But as he emerged from the underground network at dawn on Sunday morning, he knew that the shadows that had protected his family were about to give way to a light that would expose everything. The federal task force arrived in Cedar Falls at 6:30 a.m., their unmarked vehicles converging on locations throughout the town with the precision of a military operation. Agent Sarah Chen, who had been secretly investigating the Watchers for over 5 years, met the Henderson family and their allies at a safe house on the outskirts of town, where the evidence they had gathered would finally see the light of day. "What you've brought us," Agent Chen said as she reviewed Elena's downloaded files, "is more comprehensive than anything we've been able to gather through traditional investigation. These servers contained not just the Cedar Falls operation, but detailed records of similar networks in 6 other states." Rosa watched in amazement as James Henderson, a man who had been presumed dead for 3 decades, worked alongside federal agents to decode the Watchers' communications and identify key members of the conspiracy. The transformation from hidden exile to active participant in bringing down the organization that had stolen his life was remarkable to witness. Dr. Wright found himself serving as a historical consultant, helping agents understand how the underground network had been developed and maintained over multiple generations. His knowledge of Cedar Falls's architecture and his family's connection to the church's original construction proved invaluable in mapping the complete scope of the Watchers' infrastructure. Elena's technical skills became crucial as she helped federal investigators understand the sophisticated surveillance systems the Watchers had used to monitor entire communities. The scope of the privacy violations was staggering. Thousands of people had been watched, recorded, and analyzed without their knowledge or consent for decades. Dorothy, despite her advanced age, proved to be one of the most valuable witnesses the federal task force had encountered. Her 30 years of careful observation and her intimate knowledge of the Watchers' public faces within the community provided agents with insights that would have taken months to develop through traditional investigation. As the evidence was analyzed and cross-referenced with other ongoing investigations, a picture emerged of a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything the Cedar Falls group had imagined. The Watchers weren't just operating in small towns. They had been conducting similar experiments in urban areas, suburban communities, and rural regions throughout the United States. Integration Day was just the beginning, Agent Chen explained to the group as more federal agents arrived to begin the process of dismantling the underground network. The techniques they perfected here were going to be implemented nationally as part of a program to create what they called managed communities, places where every aspect of social and economic life could be controlled through sophisticated manipulation rather than obvious force. Margaret Henderson finally spoke publicly about her family's ordeal, describing to federal investigators how they had been forced to choose between exposing a conspiracy they couldn't prove and protecting innocent people who would be hurt if the Watchers felt threatened. The decision to disappear had been agonizing, but it had allowed them to gather evidence that no outside investigator could have obtained. The arrests began that afternoon. Cedar Falls residents watched in shock as people they had trusted for decades, business leaders, church board members, town council officials, were taken into custody by federal agents. The Watchers' network of control, which had seemed so powerful and permanent, crumbled within hours once their communications were compromised and their financial records were exposed. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when Agent Chen announced that the Cedar Falls investigation had provided evidence needed to shut down similar operations in 47 other communities across 12 states. The breathing wall that Rosa had discovered had ultimately led to the exposure of the largest domestic surveillance and social control conspiracy in American history. Rosa stood in the sanctuary of Harmony Baptist Church that evening, looking at the wall that had started everything. The bricks had been permanently removed, revealing the passage that connected the church to the underground network. But instead of hiding secrets, the opening now represented transparency, a symbol of how hidden truths could be brought into the light through courage and determination. "It's over," Margaret said, joining Rosa beside the wall that had hidden her family's fight for 3 decades. "The Watchers are finished, their network is dismantled, and the communities they controlled are finally free to make their own choices without manipulation or coercion." Elena approached them, carrying a folder containing printouts of news reports that were already beginning to appear as the story broke nationally. "The media is calling it the largest domestic conspiracy case since Watergate," she said. "But they're also calling all of you heroes." Dr. Wright and Dorothy joined the group, and for the first time in 30 years, the people who had fought to protect Cedar Falls were able to stand together in the open, no longer hiding from Watchers who had been watching them. The breathing wall had led them through a journey that had tested their courage, their loyalty, and their faith in the possibility that truth could triumph over even the most sophisticated deception. James Henderson emerged from the underground passage, carrying the last of his family's possessions from their hidden home. "We can finally go home," he said simply, looking around the sanctuary where his journey into the shadows had begun 3 decades earlier. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Rosa realized that the breathing wall had done more than reveal a hidden passage. It had opened a doorway to justice that had been sealed for far too long. The mystery that had begun with a simple maintenance job had ended with the exposure of a conspiracy that had threatened the very foundations of American democracy. The Watchers were gone, their secrets exposed, their power broken. And in the little town of Cedar Falls, Virginia, people could finally breathe freely, knowing that they were no longer being watched by those who claimed to protect them while secretly controlling everything they did. The breathing wall would remain open as a reminder that some secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, will eventually find their way to the light through the courage of ordinary people who refuse to accept that truth should remain buried in the darkness.